Right, I think it's probably time to make a start. So, if let's do that. Um, so, either good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you draw the line on those things. Welcome to the panel, which is what makes fan writing British. My name is Ian Millsted, and I'm kind of a teacher of politics by profession and sort of dabble in occasional fanish things, although somewhat sparsely. So I also come to this as probably more of a novice than my esteemed colleagues here. So I'm in a position I want to be persuaded really about some of the people that have been mentioned in the description and why I, as somebody who wasn't around when a lot of that was being written, would want to go back and read some of those. But we'll also try and range more broadly than that and look at this from a number of different perspectives. But first of all, I will ask my panel to introduce themselves. So if we start off to my immediate left.
Hi, I'm Christina. I have written British fanzines and I have read lots of British fanzines and other fanzines. And I'll move on to Joseph.
Very sparse. I'm Joseph Nicholas. Probably been around far too bloody long. In my time, I have published innumerable fanzines. For a time, I even wrote fanzine reviews, also literary reviews for the BSFA. I haven't produced much in writing over the past 10 years because I've been consumed with gardening. Actually, more than 10 years, about 25 years, in fact.
It's a very British occupation.
Sorry, my apologies. Nevertheless, I'm still interested in still read fanzines. Yvonne.
I'm a retired fan writer. It's pretty poor, really. I read a lot of fanzines in my time. The fan writers that Ian talked about yesterday, I hadn't read any of them.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll hear a bit more about some of those and others as well. So start off by asking each of you to sort of give your own sort of personal view on this idea of what sort of Britishness of fan writing, really. I mean, without sort of getting into kind of stereotypes or anything, but well, unless it's really funny, in which case you can. What do you see as kind of like British fan writing, and can you give us sort of one or two good examples, do you think? I don't know who wants to go first on that one.
I would happily say that of the writers we looked at, Don West was your quintessential Yorkshire fan writer. He wasn't just English. He was very definitely Bingley and Keithley fan writer. and there was a lot that I mean, I've only read him very recently. I mean, very, very recently. And I found some of it very dark, some of it very funny, some of it very nasty about people. But all in all, I think there was a real humanity behind Don. And he was very kind. Even though I did a very bad thing that you may not be aware of.
I'm intrigued.
When I started writing fanzines, he after a little while started sending me cartoons, which were always brilliant. I mean, whenever I got a fanzine, what I used to do was open it and look through to find the D West cartoons. But he sent me these fabulous cartoons, and sometime at a Corfu somewhere in America, Victor Gonzalez sidled up to me and said, "You've done something to really upset Dee. He's furious with you." And it turned out that I hadn't been aware that, although obviously the most important thing in the fanzine was the cartoons, they had to be exactly the size they were sent to you. And I'd shrunk his cartoons to fit in with the writing. Obviously a heinous crime. But over the years, he did come to forgive me. Many, many years.
Interesting that you localized D solely to Keighley, and what was the other place you mentioned?
Bingley.
Bingley, yeah. There's very definitely a Yorkshire tone to his writing, but I think he could be both very serious and very funny at the same time. I recall in response to some American response to one of his articles, he brooded on whether to respond, and then thought, given that the average American version of a snappy rejoinder runs to at least 3 pages, I figure I should save my energies for staying awake during the counterattack. And there was another line I remember writing about his early terms in British fandom in the 1960s, before many of us knew him. In fact, I think he might have dropped out at the end of the 60s, only to re-emerge in the mid-70s. Reviewing his earlier career, he said he abandoned his persona of fake niceness. Not immediately, it fell away in pieces, and took to writing letters sprinkled with snarls, maledictions, and recipes for unnatural methods of self-destruction. I still didn't get published, but I felt a lot better. But also, sorry, don't hog the microphone here, but I think Dee was also a theorist, not ideologically so. I mean, he published a volume called Fanzines in Theory and Practice, where he was specific about not what fanzines were or what they should be, but why they existed, why people published fanzines, and to what they could aspire. This is not something I think anybody else would have done.
I think some of those things you said about the kind of run through maybe the British fandom and fanzines as they were when I first came into British fandom in the start of the 1980s. There did seem to be a big emphasis on excellence, on fanzines as art, on doing better with your fanzine. There was also some fairly, maybe slightly cruel put downs for fanzines that didn't conform. Now, I don't know if this is quintessentially British. It may be more quintessentially of its age, but it did just sort of reading some British fanzines in juxtaposition with, I know, the early 70s, the Energumens. It did feel like there was a very different feel to what fandom was all about for the British fanzine writer. And a lot of it was about how good their writing would be, and also producing fanzines that were not just, you know, throwaway bits of paper. They were actually, in some respects, art, in some respects, something that you really had to commit to, rather than just wanting to write a fanzine because you want to review science fiction or because you want to talk about a writer or whatever. In fact, that leads me to the other very strong characteristic of British fan writing at the time I came in, which was it's very anti-Circon. There was a definite feeling that that kind of stuff had been done in the 60s and was a bit dull and was maybe done by Australians or Americans, but we didn't need to be done by British fan writers when it was all about the party and living the Fanish life.
So what I've read of D West, which is not a huge amount, but the Yorkshire thing and the sort of Keighley thing, that distinctive thing. One of the things oddly that it reminded me of, and this will probably sound very weird, was cricket commentary by Geoffrey Boycott. That coming across as very critical, but from a sense of actually being really interested in sort of caring about the thing that was actually kind of sort of being done, and from somebody who'd sort of been there as well. But that's probably complete nonsense, so yeah, forget that. Okay, it's interesting. So we've been along the line. Everybody sort of mentioned Don West. So one of the questions I had for later on, but as it's come up, I think I'm sort of going to run with this at the moment. Is this idea of kind of like a sort of regional thing? Is it are these writers British, or are they actually representing almost like a kind of like a regional point of view? And I think I think Eve Harvey, I'm less sure on this because I think she sort of moved around a little bit more. But I mean, Peter Weston is generally associated with Birmingham, and Abi Frost with London. But is that actual regionalism something which is distinctively kind of sort of British that you wouldn't? I mean, that gives the people that sort of quality.
I think I was born into Brum fandom, and Pete Weston was obviously the leading light, but there was Martin Tudor and Steve Green, and Tony Berry wasn't writing when I came into fanzine fandom, but there was definitely very Birmingham centered writing, and in fact I'm losing my words again. Dave Hicks, who put together amusing and interesting fanzines for Novacons, was, although he didn't live in Birmingham, he wrote in a very Birmingham fandom sort of way. And having read some of the Yorkshire, the Leeds-based fanzines, there was I've read Michael Ashley's stuff. Whew. And they were very much centered around the people, the fans in Leeds, in the same way that the Brum Group were centered around the fans in Birmingham. An outlier from that, and more recently when I started writing, was Sue Jones, Tortoise. Yeah. And hers was based in Shrewsbury, and it was definitely a Shrewsbury fancy. It was very much centered around Shrewsbury.
And of course, I was part of the Bristol SF group, and we did a fanzine called Balloons Over Bristol, and that was definitely centered around what was going on in Bristol and in our fan group. In terms of someone like Eve Harvey, I feel from reading Woolbang and so forth that there's quite a strong, I suppose, a strong sense of her and John and their lives, but their lives were part of a generally wider version of London fandom, which I'm sure Joseph could say more about. But when you read them, you do get a feeling that they are part of at least a friendship group that is loosely geographically based. But I'm happy to be corrected.
I'm not sure that I can talk about London fandom, and there's certainly in the late 70s, God, when I was much younger and had more hair than I do now. In the late 70s, there was a bunch called the Surrey Limprists, which was formed initially as a joke name. At one of the Silicons in the late 70s were putting up five-a-side football teams, and there was a group of us from Surrey, me, Alan Dorey, Ian Moore, Kevin Smith, and someone else I don't remember. Anyway, photo call before the thing, before the matches come on, we said, shall we do this with a limp wrist? So we all had limp wrists, became known as the Surrey Limprists, and from that spawned an APA called Slapper, which existed for only about 18 months, but it was immensely fun to do, mostly talking about the things we did in West London, Surrey, West London area. But beyond that, I find it difficult to detect any sense of regionalism in British fan writing, with the, apart from, now that Yvonne has drawn it to my attention, Dee's writing, because there is a very Yorkshire hard-edged tone to some of his stuff, which you would not expect from other writers, certainly not from me. As I say, I find it difficult to... Sorry? See you later. I've lost my thread. I've lost my thread now. As I was saying, I find it difficult to find a particularly regional voice in anything. There may be regionally located groups, such as Bristol, such as groups in Leeds or in Birmingham, but do they write in a particularly Leeds, Bristolian or Birmingham way?
I think you're right, Joseph. I think what I've been looking at is the references within the writing rather than the actual tone of the writing. So I think there's a general, you could say the generally British tone, but perhaps it is harder to detect regional accents. I don't know. What about Welsh fan writing? He says, looking to see that Rob Hansen's already gone, maybe. And
Certainly not in the
obviously
room.
Irish.
When I first joined, Ken Cheslin, does anyone remember Ken Cheslin?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Irish.
Ken Cheslin, who was a lovely guy, sent me a load of John Berry, not John D. Berry, but John Berry fanzines, which were all Northern Irish. Yeah. And I read all of those, and it made me feel particularly happy to be writing just wimpy girly stuff, because it was all terribly nice and yeah, very friendly. I think if I'd read Abi or D, I wouldn't have put my head above the parapet, because I was not writing serious political or anything sort of stuff.
Or even Joseph. I was scared to give my first fanzine to Joseph
Why?
because I thought you'd say some horrible things. In fact, you wrote me a really nice lot that I was very happy to receive. It all worked out well in the
There
end.
you are. My bark is obviously worse than my bite.
I got two particularly memorable locks for my first fanzine. One was from Joe, which was a lovely letter and very encouraging. And the other one was from Ian Sorensen, who suggested that he would keep my fanzine in case I became a friend, so he could laugh at me about it, and suggested that to become properly fanish, I should be really nasty about Joe.
So I think so far we've identified a sort of a cutting humour and also a self-deprecatory humour as being distinctive features. What other features of fan writing would you say
I've got one.
lend themselves to some a sort of Britishness, please?
I've got one. Drink. I've even got a quote from Harvey saying, going back to alcohol, drink is a vital constituent of things vanish. And I think that is something that is true in British fandom, but maybe less true in other fandoms. I was very shocked when I first went to Australia and there didn't seem to be everyone in the bar. No, that is true.
Do you want to wait for the mic?
And obviously US fandom was made in a lot of places was more into other substances than alcohol.
Like that, all right?
And I read a really interesting thing in Wallbanger, which was an interview between Eve and Roy Kettle. And there was an awful lot of drink and vomit involved in it.
Since I have the microphone, I was just going to observe that Australian fandom in the 70s and 80s was also written on drink. In particular, John Bankson's greatest writing was probably written. I remember Velma and I went to visit him one time in Canberra, and this is before they invented the wine flask, the collapsible wine flasks. There were boxes of flagons of wine piled up behind the back door, and Velma and I stayed a week, and I just remember one evening I was spending more time trying to sit up than I was actually doing anything. But I don't think anything John wrote for many years was written in a sober state, which maybe explained the fluidity of his writing style.
Okay, Joseph, did you want to add any other characteristics?
Gosh. Well, one of the things that's a wild generalization that's made about British fan writing in comparison with anybody else is that Brits do irony, whereas other peoples don't. But I think that's such a wild generalization, it can't possibly be true.
I think Roman wants to say something there.
Yeah, we've got a contribution.
Yeah, I just want to point out that there are fanzines by Yvonne Rousseau and John Foister that certainly, I think, fit the requirement for being interesting, intelligent, and about doing fanish things. Now, I don't think either of them can be claimed to be British, but I think they are good fan writers.
Hang on. So, I'll just give my panelists, if somebody wants to, anybody want to pick up on that at all or respond to that?
I would only say that Ian Moore at one point said, he opened an envelope and said, "Oh God, it's another Australian fanzine."
Yeah, in the NAF Awards, which we might talk about later, it does include NAF fanzines are all Australian fanzines. But it also has Paperback Inferno that Joseph was doing.
This is a document produced by Malcolm Edwards when he was still basically, well, when he was not the big publisher that he is now, for the NAF Awards, which is it's 4 pages of excruciatingly silly stuff. You may read it out later. Blah, blah, blah. Plans to resume US distribution have just fallen through, to which we say, tough shit, Yankee.
Okay, Farah, do you want to?
Yeah, this is coming from the perspective of being less involved in fanzines with many of you, but also being very involved internationally. And for me, the big thing that stands out all the time is simply that we're a very tight community and all know each other. And the time it really paid off, I don't know how many of you are affected by somebody called Requires Hate, a rather unpleasant little troll. Oh, good. I'm so glad most of you don't know her. But part of her operating procedure was that she would make friends with somebody and then get them to spill the beans on other people and then use it against them. Well, she tried it in Britain and it failed miserably because we talk to each other. We communicate. We all know each other. And it began to unravel really quickly when she tried to move into UK fandom.
And had we already all been rude about each other beforehand, so the damage wasn't there to be done? I don't know.
Yes, there's a lot of being rude about other people, but generally not behind their backs and not in the sort of big feuding way that has happened elsewhere.
So I take your point. I'll come in a minute. The point about how we're seen from outside of this country as well is an interesting one, which I'll come back to later on, I think. So so I wanted to give Yvonne a chance to comment on that, but we've also got a contribution from the back, so we'll take that.
So hi, I've got 2 comments to make. One, I've done fanzines in New Zealand, England, and America. I think I write with a New Zealand characteristic, which is something that carries across no matter which country I'm living in at that moment, which is kind of ironic because I was born in England, spent more than half my life now living in the States. But I'm still like very New Zealand centric in the points that I like to bring across. The other thing was about New Zealand culture. Alcohol was only a big feature at parties. It wasn't when people were doing fanzines for the most part, because people took that very seriously and they wanted to give it their all. But when it came to one-shots, alcohol was totally involved. And a lot of the funniest one-shots, and quite frankly, a lot of the funniest New Zealand fan writing was in one-shots, where alcohol was the sort of the unnamed contributor.
Okay, thank you. So Yvonne, other characteristics, or do you want to contribute?
I'm going to make a response to that about alcohol, is that I recall, I think when Americans first encountered sort of British writing about alcohol and parties, they became convinced that we were a nation of complete drunkards, always wallowing in vomit and so forth. When they encountered the actuality, of course, they couldn't match the actuality with what they had in their heads, and I don't know, went home schizophrenic perhaps. No, I think
Was it all exaggeration?
it was all exaggeration, of course.
Was there no falling over drunk and throwing up in shoes? I'm sure there's something in the NAP Awards about that.
About Steve.
There is a legendary story about Steve Green throwing up in somebody's shoes. Yes.
Okay, so Keith. Yep.
The story I heard when I first came into fandom was that the Americans exaggerated the goings on at conventions, and the British, being somewhat British, thought it was true, and we did it. And the Americans came over eventually and found that what they were getting was what we had thought they were starting with, and they weren't. It was a complete reversal.
Yeah, all right. And Australians read British fanzines and thought that's what you do at conventions. So we were just doubling up on what Americans had done.
I think one of the things that I found interesting in what Dee had written about fanzines was it's all about context. And one of the things that I found trying to catch up on what Don had written was that I had no idea about the context because I hadn't read them in the fanzines. And the people whose fanzines I read, generally speaking, were people I knew, and I knew the context in detail. And in fact, I've had some comments from Hazel that has enlightened me on some of the, and from Ian actually, on some of the Leeds groups going on. But context is missing when you're looking at fan anthologies, if you like. Unless they're all, and I don't know, I haven't looked at this one yet because it's in Ian's possession, but unless it's all from the same year and the same basic set of fans, it's not going to give you the context of the fanzines of the time.
I was going to talk about time because we talked about region, and actually the time in which people are writing is obviously quite important. I mean, with Don West, I mean, a lot of what he's best known for in terms of writing is from the late 70s to early 80s. After that, he seems to become, as far as I can see, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, better known for his artwork in publications. Now, does anybody have insights into, did he write less? Did he stop writing to become less interested? Had he said what he wanted to say with regards to fanzines, and that was his main point of interest? I know he did write about other things, Brontes and so forth, but...
Well, I was going to say, but you've kind of stolen that. In 2000, he did write quite a long article about the Brontes, but it was also about fandom as well. And he did tend to write these long articles that he would certainly give to, I guess, some to Hazel, some to Simon Owsley, definitely. Because I was saying earlier, I could not find our copy of Fanzines Inferior Practice and so forth, and I wanted to read things in the garden, so I didn't want to look online. So I was looking through the Leeds fanzines to find some of the lesser known D West works, and he was still writing long articles in which, okay, maybe there was less theory in the Bronte article from 2000, but it still had some, which I've probably written some down, but I won't bore you with it at the moment.
My favorite article of the ones that I've read recently was The Secret Life of Nigel E. Hedgehog. And I don't know Nigel Richardson. So I don't know how true to life it is, but it was a lovely piece of work, and I very much enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, the context for that is absolutely necessary. You had to know Nigel personally to actually get all the jokes, as it were.
But
that's a different sort of context, though.
Yeah, because there's also, taking that kind of context, there's also an article by Nigel himself, which he writes in the persona of Simon Owsley, where you have to have read Simon Owsley's con reports but also as Nigel Richardson. So you kind of have to know them both. And that's really funny if you do.
Dee also wrote an article in the style of Greg Pickersgill. It was only short, only a couple of pages, but you could be fooled into thinking it was Greg.
Okay, I think we have a contribution from the back, which we'll take.
I just mentioned that I also enjoyed the Secret Diary of Nigel Lee, whatever, Hedgehog. And in response, I wrote The Secret Diary of Dee West and put that in an issue of Bob. And he thought it was a loving portrait of his life and style, and his habit of well, he had a gas fire. It was the only heating he had, and he would light it with a match. But he would light it with a match by throwing the match from about 6 feet away, because usually there was a leak. And you didn't want to be too close when it burst into flame. So, but for him, that was just natural.
Was that the cheese?
And the cheese.
Yeah.
Endless cheese.
Yeah, that was my first introduction to Don, was that really quite charming article by Ian, which I think was in one of the Bobs that I was sent to review for Matrix.
So we talked about Dee West quite a bit there. We mentioned Eve Harvey. Who else would we think of as being kind of good examples? I'll come on to maybe some bad examples later on. But who else would be good examples of people that we should be going back to read, perhaps as writers, fan writers, whose work is lasting, but also has the that sort of quality of Britishness, which we seem to be focusing on.
Simon Ownsley.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Can you elaborate on that? Why?
Simon's an excellent writer. He also writes books, but Simon's an excellent writer. But I think possibly both of these two know better, and both said yes, so they can elaborate for me.
Thanks for dropping us in.
Well, I think it's a reasonable suggestion, actually.
He did like writing about vegetables a lot, and it was very British in its kind of focus on the small things in life that he could, in a very surreal way, make amusing. But maybe Joseph can say something better.
Well, I was actually going to mention John Collick. Now, he didn't write very much in the late 70s, but he did produce some extremely parodic artwork. God, I can't remember. One was a parody of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which had elements of Apocalypse Now mixed into it. It was done as a sort of cut for a few fanzines more. Thank you very much. Which was very parodic. You really had to know the people parodied in that to understand. It was done as a comic strip. You had to know the people parodied in that to really get all the jokes, all the insights. And I don't think anybody else could have done it.
And did that make him quite British?
Yeah, I think so, because it displayed sort of elements of self-deprecation, of parody, of sending up other people as well as himself, satire, knowledge of popular culture, all sort of mixed together, which I think a Britain can do very well, but others may have trouble.
I suppose I would go back to Abi Frost as well. I find her writing quite stylish and amusing, but it is also very British and of its time, and just sort of occasional political references, occasional things that mention Channel 4 and the British education system, and all kinds of things that make it feel deeply embedded in British writing, but also maybe going onto that whole British class system, a bit of a way of also being elitist about her references and the kind of way she talks about things and the way she put people down is a little bit upper class British. So that might get up people's noses as well. I appreciate that. I quite enjoy it. I like the way she puts her words together.
Okay.
I was thinking about something you mentioned earlier, I think Mike Ashley.
Yeah.
And I think there's something quintessentially British about this sort of very empty scape, this Eddie Izzard, the comedian, does a whole set about, you know, oh, I want to be an astronaut. I thought, you know, tone it down a bit. You're British. Well, I want to work in a shoe shop. Well, tone it down a British. Well, I want to lie in a gutter, and it's that sort of emptiness and desolation. And Mike does that so beautiful. There was a one I read where he's describing just a trip back to Bradford on the train, and it's just there's an emptiness and a desolation about it. It kind of runs out of the post-war Britain. I mean, of course, it's later, it's the 70s, but there's still sort of the 60s, you know, where all the buildings have been demolished, and then the 70s is still a bit grim, and there's that grimness and that we're a bit shit. And I think that there's that like a thread running through, and Dee obviously picks up on that sort of thing as well.
And Nigel Richardson as well.
I don't know whether Mike carried on writing or whether the desolation got too much for him, because he was working as a social worker in Bradford, and from the things I've heard, it sounds hideous. I mean, Hazel has said, you know, you'd be walking through Bradford and he'd say, oh yeah, there's one of my people. They're dead now, but there was a lot of that. And I think, I don't know whether it was self-fulfilling prophecy, but he's a very kind man. But yes, I think complete desolation.
I think he's part of the post-punk era. So maybe the tone of British fan writing changed later on in the 80s for the people that had kind of grown up being a bit more depressed and punk this is just a theory, in the late 70s, early 80s.
Still to this day, in my day job, I help students write applications for university, and I'm frequently telling people to sort of be more positive and big themselves up, and there's that sort of British kind of reserve which you don't get. Okay, I've even helped students apply to American universities, and it's a whole extra thing again. You have to sort of complete different mindset in terms of applying. However, that's a digression. Keith.
No, the one thing that's coming over to me is that the British fanish writing is a reflection of the British writing, P.G. Wodehouse and people like that, where there's a gentle humour, whereas certain other countries, it's a cruel humour.
The British could be cruel as well.
Yeah. But I was thinking, you know, it kind of, you know, the fanish writing is more or less a reflection of the standard, quote, British writing. I mean, I'm not talking about James Bond and all the rest of the rubbish, but as I say, P.G. Wodehouse came to mind. I mean, you know, there he's writing about Jeeves as a complete idiot and so on and so forth. Yeah, in a kind of way. I mean, you feel for Jeeves, but oh well, that's just my thought. It was coming to me as you were saying various things. Oh,
Well,
I think there's something in that, because you know, fan writers are obviously reading, you know, all the time, and they're going to be influenced by what they're reading. If you read fan writing from the 1950s, it reflects kind of, you know, popular fiction of the previous 10 years, obviously cumulative, and so by the time you get to the 1980s, it's, you know, it's, you know, people have been watching the Boys and Black stuff on television or whatever. You know, that's going to come through in what they're writing, I would think. But sorry, Joseph.
I was just going to make the obvious point that anything you write is going to be informed by the culture in which you were brought up. Obviously, if you're brought up as an Englishman living in, say, West London, you're going to absorb that culture, what you went through in school, what you did for after school, what sort of job you got.
And also, well, in my case, I stressed it a lot of times, that get influenced by the kind of magazines or newspapers you read, the kind of writers you read regularly. So I grew up, well, I graduated onto the New Musical Express, which had this whole style of being quite rude about things, about pulling things down, but also being funny and not being too serious about everything and trying to pull down anybody that was trying to be too serious. It was of its time. And then people got into smash hits and could be a lot more fun in their fan writing.
I always saw those having very different readerships, but
I have a point of my own, which is again to do with follow on from Keith about gentle humour in the various cultures in which it's written. I mean, I would probably add Jerome K. Jerome alongside P.G. Wodehouse to the British canon of gentle humour. But there are American equivalents. I mean, the name Garrison Keillor springs to mind as being somebody who has written gentle humour in the States. And I think this panel was partly supposed to be about comparison of different countries' cultures. So I was wondering, if Garrison Keillor's take on things is reflected in some of the best American humour fanzines, the kind of stuff that Terry Hughes would see printed in Motor and so on.
Yeah, so this is probably the right. Thank you for the question, because I think it's probably an opportune time to sort of start thinking about how a lot of these writers are seen beyond these shores. So we have in the audience here people who've sort of moved and lived in different countries, and have a sort of probably an awareness anyway. I mean, to what extent were Don West and Abi Frost kind of read much by people outside of Britain, and if so, were they kind of welcomed? My research for this, I sort of found a comment on from an old file 770 where somebody was commenting on Abi Frost being very negative in her kind of reports on kind of American worldcons, and kind of was thought that was a bit rude. I don't know. Anybody want to comment on that? So, or does anybody from the audience, those of you who do live outside of the UK, how is British fan writing seen, if it is at all, beyond these shores?
We haven't mentioned Dave Langford at all.
Okay, so Gary?
Sorry, that wasn't meant to be a derailment. That was more meant to be, as far as I could see, Dave Langford was the quintessential British fan writer as seen from overseas.
Yeah, all the humor and everything. So as someone who came into fandom later than many people in this room, British fan writing has always seemed to be a higher bar standard than I'm used to finding. We've got good American fan writers, but British fan writing just shines. It's crisp. It's either funny or, kill the fuckers fanzine reviews, or, it's whatever it is. And it's a variety of things, but it's always a quintessentially what it is. You don't find many, or I don't find many British fan writers just kind of chatting along and talking about stuff. There's a point and it's tightly constructed, and it seems like a bar to try to achieve. And, I'll name Christina Lake. I'll name both Claire Briley and Mark Plummer. I'll name Dave Langford. When he had been getting what
Maybe Roy Ketley was in the audience.
I have not read enough of Roy's work. I will certainly enjoy more of it. I have enjoyed what I have read. But when Langford was getting, Hugo after Hugo after Hugo, and he was kind of going, I'm not going to withdraw, because then it's like, oh, well, I'm the best fan writer so long as Dave Langford isn't on the ballot. And I was really trying to look for, there was a year where he's on the ballot and I'm reading everybody. And then he had like a collection out that year. And he'd say, shit, this is better than anything here. And my attitude on Hugo's is, it doesn't matter whether you know the person or not. You vote for the best, because anything else is an insult to your friends or to, whomever. You vote for the best. And it was like, he really was. He always was. I was going to say, do you have something, Rich?
Yeah, I
agree with you that Langford was one of the best fan writers, but I do recall, I believe I was at the Montreal Worldcon, standing in line to go into the Hugos or something, and people in front of me that I had no idea who they were. They weren't fanzine fans probably, but they just said, God, it's got to be anyone but Langford. I can't stand him. He's going on forever. It's just like they were tired of him. So I think, it had become kind of like, this is always Langford's award after a while. But you asked about Abi Frost.
Yeah.
She came into fandom after I had gone back to the States. And I didn't see much of her earliest writings and stuff, but when I did see her writings, it was brilliant. She was one of the very best fan writers I've ever seen out of British fandom or any fandom. And as for people, gentle humor in British fandom, I would say Brosnan wasn't always that gentle. He was extremely funny, which kind of took off the edge, but he was pretty brutal, a lot of the things that he said about people.
I think that the problem with Dave for a lot of us is a lot of us younger fanzine people was that we didn't see anything other than Ansible. And you know, Ansible's great, you know, who's dead and so on, but it's not. Well, yes, but again, it's
a limited joke, really.
Yeah.
And also, Thog isn't Langford. He's just appropriating daft quotes from, or stupid quotes from daft books.
I think, Farah, if you can get the mic to her.
This is a slight segue, but I suddenly realized when Jerry was talking that there is actually a difference in the way Brits and Americans are taught to write. We used to get a lot of students over on junior year abroad. And almost the first thing we had to do was sit them down and explain how a topic essay that they had learned to write couldn't get more than a C under the British system. So there's nothing fundamentally wrong with a topic essay if that's what you want. But the topic essay was very much, I'm going to write around this subject with extremely beautiful language, often, I'm afraid, quite meaningless, but that's because they were young, not because they're American. Whereas the British system from A level upwards is, and you will begin with an argument, and then you will say what you're going to use to argue it, and then you're going to argue it ferociously, and at the end you're going to tell everybody what they should think. And I think it makes from a punchier style and possibly a more journalistic style as well. And that may be a genuine difference between the two schools of fan writing.
Okay, we've got just one back there. While the microphone's being carried around, so just something to think about, and we'll come to it in a minute after the next contribution is, so we've been talking about sort of positive things, we've been saying lots of nice things about British fan writers. What would be the negatives? What are the tropes that we would identify as being British, which we go, oh, no, perhaps, but we'll take the contribution at the back first.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you would consider the writings of Bruce Gillespie and John Foister, as well as John Bankson. So we've got Gillespie doing reviews and commentary on SF works. We've got Foister being incredibly critical, looking at the serious writing material. And we've got Bankson writing the most soft, beautiful, funny pieces. How much influence do they have on people here in terms of reading those fan writers?
Well, I don't think when certainly not when I started writing fanzines, I think British fandom was in some ways still quite parochial, quite British. And the only Australian fanzines we used to get were Time, which which led to this feeling, but maybe Australian fanzines weren't that great. And so there is a bit of negative stuff in this. Did I already read anything about the Australian fanzines? And also like D West in early 1980s said the only good thing about American fandom is it isn't Australian fandom. So I think it's a vastly unfair way of considering Australian fandom, because I've read all these writers and they do amazing things, and we became more aware of that as certainly as the 80s continued, do you reckon, into the 90s? I mean, we also had Lee and Valma. Was it just Lee, or was it Lee and Valma working with you and Judith to do just kind of...
Initially, yes, on what became FTT.
Mhm. So we became gradually exposed to more Australian fanzines, and certainly Bruce Gillespie's fanzines came over and were amazing. So, but I don't think they had a lot of influence at the time. And sorry to keep talking, but just to get this in quickly before I forget, maybe one of the weaknesses of the way the British fans writing worked was it was very anti-Circon. So it was very much that we didn't write seriously about science fiction. We just wrote seriously about fandom, which perhaps limited what fanzines did during the 1970s and 1980s.
Certainly, before we take another comment from the floor, certainly I would agree with Christina that British fandom, certainly in the 1970s, was very parochial. We very rarely looked overseas. Much more focused on our own
differences.
Our own. God. Much more focused on what we could do for ourselves and less interested in what other fandoms did or said.
Well, it would have been just a lot more difficult. I mean, people didn't travel as much between, North America and Europe at that time. It was expensive. You couldn't look things up on the internet, obviously. So, it would have been, you write about what you know about to a large extent. So it kind of makes sense. So I think, can we get the mic to Richard front?
On the anti-Circon bit, I'm just thinking Pete Weston was doing speculation for most of this, and it was very good. And I think people enjoyed it. And a lot of Spanish fans, like Malcolm Edwards, I can remember, was doing Vector and or Matrix, one of those. So I think there was a Circon element, even though these were kind of Spanish fans. I mean, Pete was probably never really that Spanish, but he got along with the Spanish fans.
I think by the time the early 80s came around, when I got into fandom, there was definitely a backlash against 60s fanzines and Pete Weston's fanzines, and even people. I think, yes, if you were into the BSFA, you would read their magazines, but they weren't the top list in the fanzine. But Joseph would know more about that, as you were around and you wrote for the BSFA.
Well, yeah, I wrote stuff for the BSFA in the 1980s. By way of context, Ian Maul and I published a fanthology for the an unofficial 1979 unofficial fanthology for 1979 Worldcon. As a postscript to that, I wrote a highly ideological history of 1970s fandom, depicting it as arising from the ashes of the late 60s to its vanished glory in the late 70s, and wondering what would come next. But I think that was informed by the parochiality that we felt at the time. It was inner directed. We wanted to better ourselves, to achieve.
There's also, surely, as a generational cyclical thing going on, that people will always kind of react against what went before. And the Circon stuff that Peter Weston was doing from the mid 60s onwards was kind of a reaction against the slightly sort of silly fanzine kind of approach from the mid 50s to the late to mid 60s.
Right. Yes, I agree with that.
The other thing that you've got to think about is where you start getting your fanzines from. So when I started because Chris Turan from Matrix had sent me a handful of fanzines, including one of Joe's, to read and comment on. And so my first fanzine I sent to the people that I had commented on, and gradually the people who I sent stuff to and received stuff from expanded. But it wasn't until much later that I started getting stuff from. I don't think I got very much at all from Australia, and not a great deal from America. And it wasn't really until Chunga that I started getting stuff that I thought was brilliant and would happily read and comment on. But it when you come into fanzine fandom, you come in from a point source and expand.
Okay. Jerry again.
I wanted to come back to Abi Frost because she came to Minneapolis on her TAF trip. I hosted her. I didn't know her before. And had I known Abi and as I'd been familiar with her writing, I would have set up to have her go stay with Joe Weston or David Stever or Garth Danielson. And she would have been much more comfortable because there's this thing called Minneapolis Nice or Minnesota Nice, and it completely freaked her out. Because if you were being nice to her, that meant you hated her. And so you talk about these different pockets of, yes, there was Circon fanzine publishing here in the UK, and you go to Victor Gonzalez or you go to Joe West or whatever, and that biting, sharp, deprecating humor that Abi was so good at, and just that incisive, right at it. They did that too. And if you can get hooked, again, the point that Yvonne said about the point where you come in, if we could have hooked up Abi, at least in Minneapolis, she would have liked Minneapolis a lot better.
Okay. So we've been taking questions and points all the way through, but we've got a limited amount of time. So if people do have questions, now's the time.
Well, I'm pleased that you like Chunga all of a sudden. I wanted to say, I mean, the British fanzines from the 70s did not get much circulation in the US at all. And I happened to be one of the few people that did get a lot of them and passed them on to people in Seattle as, great Seattle fandom was getting going. And I think it influenced them a bit on things like Chunga and Izzard and stuff like that.
Okay. Any other questions? So in which case I'll ask my panel. So where is the good British fan writing today? Where should somebody look? Who would you recommend? What would you recommend?
Mark and Claire.
Yeah.
Right, sorry, Yvonne, do you want to?
Mark and Claire, they are still weirdly still producing a quality fanzine on a regular basis, which I find astonishing.
Do you want to wait for the mic?
Can I say that some of the best British fan writing these days is in Ann Zappa?
I was about to say that.
Is that also by Claire and Mark?
And Alison.
Okay, Joseph, did you want to give your view on that?
Can I pass on that?
Yeah, Christina, do you want to?
Well, I would echo Mark and Claire, but I'm sure I must be able to think of some other people. Doug Bell, he's quite good. Now, Alison's got really, Alison's been doing a lot of great fan writing recently, particularly for Ideas. So, Nick Farry, he's a bit American, but yeah. And Dave Hodgson, obviously. But yeah, Nick too. Yeah, it's true. You have a very British voice.
It does read very British.
Yeah, we could have mentioned you more.
So I think we're probably sort of getting close to time. Yeah, we are pretty much. So thank you very much, everybody, for making really good contributions there, and also for having an audience with lots of fine fan writers in. It's always good. And thank you very much to our panelists.
Thank you, Ian.
We should have mentioned you. Sorry.